not to discount Max's brilliance, but it was so much simpler for him to just come through the field. Very much on par with the Red Bull, as much as I'm sure Max fans won't want to admit that. The RB19 on average over the whole season was 7/10 faster per lap in the race. There are a lot of similarities here. The biggest one, of course, is that after that 7-time world champion left, or in the case of Ricciardo, that 4-time world champion left for Ferrari, they brought in a young hotshot very quickly who looked to be the next. And it seems like Oscar is more confident in the car, and I think it's partly down to the fact that he doesn't get in his head so much, so he just kind of gets the job done. But if a gun was put to my head and I had to guess who would go in there, it's going to be look, I don't normally have to do this, but I need to admit when I'm wrong. And frankly, I was wrong about Colapinto. These are guidelines that are driver-led. So all of the drivers voted on these. And in fact, interestingly, only one driver voted against these, which everyone assumes... Hello and welcome to Current and Combustion. It's time to answer another week of questions. I am your bald fat host, Jason Hassett, and this is primarily about F1. There will be some more automotive questions as we go forward, but I'm keeping it very much to F1 in the time being, just to kind of get used to this new format first. So let's see what question we have to kick off this week. Straight from the dyno's mouth. Let's see what the question is here. Okay. Oh, one fell out. Let's check that back in. Okay. Let's see. Derek asks, is the MCL 39, this year's Red Bull car, more dominant, than the RB19 was in 2023? Wow. Short answer, it was at Miami in many respects. Long answer, no. So I guess it's very easy with F1 these days to kick into what is a favorite of many fans, which is recency bias, and just go, yeah, look, obviously, because it was so fast in Miami, that means it's been this dominant through the whole season, and therefore it's just that the drivers are actually washed. When in reality, it's a confluence of events that cause it to be off the pace. Very much like Max's car in Bahrain, for example, where that was just all of the things that would upset the Red Bull coming together at one track and really catching them out. This is all of the strengths of the McLaren, apart from one or two, coming together to basically show it off as the most dominant car and making, to be honest, Max's defending skills even more impressive. So if we go back to the Red Bull days of 2023, when they had the most dominant car since the McLaren MP44, was it, in 1988? I'm probably getting that wrong, but if memory serves, that's what it was. So you're talking a very, very long time, and they won every race as a team bar one, and Max won, was it 19 races out of the whole season? Checo won a couple of them. I may be wrong on those numbers as well. It's been a couple of years and I'm very old. But yeah, so look, in terms of dominance, if we go back to that season, it is similar to the McLaren in terms of qualifying pace, actually, in that the Red Bull RB19 wasn't a dominating car in terms of qualifying, even though it seemed that way in Max's hands. It was about 2/10 clear of the field in basically every race over the course of the 2023 season. Now, the 2/10 factor is really, really important. And you may realize that the Red Bull in 2023 lost, I think, 8 pole positions over the course of the season compared to just one race. And that's because 2/10 is kind of that beautiful window where the driver can make all the difference. And the reason for that is that last ultimate 2/10 of pace, you need to really string everything together in order to extract that last 2/10. And that, for me, is where Max is the best driver since Schumacher, because he does that pretty much every single weekend. And it was over the course of the 2023 season where more often than not, Max was right there. But because it was only 2/10, there was weekends where Max would miss kind of a tenth here because he's human after all. And another driver would just get that perfect string of laps together and just jump on that kind of get in that window of that tenth, and overtake. So that's right about where the MCL 39 is right now in qualifying pace. Technically speaking, it probably should be faster, but Andrea Stella, after the Miami Grand Prix, gave some interesting insights on why those like final 2/10 are so hard to hit for both drivers. So, like I said, it is probably 2/10 clear of the field, but the drivers are finding it really hard to access that last 2/10, and that's why we're seeing Max kind of beating them by a tenth or half a tenth, and then the drivers getting so close. Essentially, from what I'm hearing, it's the brake confidence is where they're struggling, along with just some suspension issue. And that is meaning that the drivers don't have utmost confidence coming into a corner, coming into kind of, say, a fast braking zone. Whereas in the slow corners, you're seeing they're just gaining massive amounts of performance here at Miami. So yeah, in qualifying, I would say it's very, very similar to the RB19 in that it should be at ultimate pace 2/10 ahead of the rest of the field. Thankfully, as I've already explained, that 2/10 is an area where if you're not on it completely through every single moment of your qualifying lap, the other drivers will catch you, and that's what we've seen so far. In terms of race pace, generally, no. Like if we look at China, Suzuka, even Bahrain, to be honest, but Bahrain was definitely a bigger gap. The McLaren has been 2 to 3 tenths faster in the race than most of the other cars. That is except for Jeddah, where it was very much on par with the Red Bull, as much as I'm sure Max fans won't want to admit that. But Jeddah was an outlier where the Red Bull was basically on par. And I think that may come down to that braking trait once again, but that would needs to be seen. And at other tracks, it's kind of 2 to 3 tenths of an advantage, which thankfully, because of the qualifying for Max and Suzuka, can again be offset by dirty air. So 2 to 3 tenths is not enough to overtake. You need a huge offset in order to overtake, unless you're willing to kind of lunge it or kind of play the game, which, we see a lot of in Miami, for example, with Max playing around. That dirty air can offset things by 3 to 4 tenths in reality and make it very, very difficult to follow, especially as tires overheat and so on. So you can see that throughout these races that it's not like a massive difference to where it's just a simple pass by the McLaren. Now, that is where the RB19 was a better racing car. The RB19 on average over the whole season was 7 tenths faster per lap in the race. That is a huge advantage when you think that that's on average. Now, obviously, that means there were certain tracks where it was closer, but there were other tracks where it was much faster than 7 tenths per lap. And that is why we saw many, many tracks where, not to discount Max's brilliance, but it was so much simpler for him to just come through the field. And part of that as well is that dirty air in 2023 is nowhere near as bad as it is now. As well. But yeah, in terms of race pace dominance, this was the first weekend where the MCL 39 was as dominant as the RB19. And let's not, mess around the bush there. It was as dominant this weekend as the RB19. And that gives fair credit to Max that he was able to use not only the dirty air, but place his car absolutely perfectly in order to get ahead of the other cars. And so in terms of dominance, no, Derek, it's not as dominant as the RB19. It was in Miami, to be fair to everyone else. But over the course of the season so far, it hasn't been. It's been very similar in qualifying, but not as dominant in the race. I guess time will tell over the course of the season. The Barcelona change is going to be a big one, although I don't think that's going to be as big of a difference as everyone is hoping it will be, given that, honestly, if a team is brilliant with their front wing at 15 millimeters of peak load allowance in movement, they're probably going to be just as good at 10 millimeters. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's just a quick interruption to say that the dinosaur has been quite sad lately because over 60% of you watching are not subscribed. And that is a clear signal that you don't like him. I mean, he's already dead. Give him a break. It's just a subscribe button. It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to bite you. That fucking thing might, though. Subscribe. Now back to the video. All right, let's see what question we have next, straight from the dyno's mouth. Just pick one at random, as usual. Ooh, Jeff. Oh, this is going to be a complicated one. What is the deal with the new overtaking rules? So, yeah, this has been a big talking point over this season so far, and I think it's only going to get worse, to be honest. But there's been a lot of Max fans, obviously, who were very upset when we first saw this kind of really take place in Jeddah. And they all started comparing, the penalties in Austin and Mexico last year. I think I've already talked about this, but we've seen this again now at Miami in overtaking on the outside and so on. But yeah, it is important to note basically that the overtaking rules were changed in 2025. Now, these rules aren't technically public. However, the race has got their hands on them with some really good reporting and some confident reporting from John Noble over there. And the race checks its sources and so on. So I think we can be confident in saying we've now seen these. Now, these are not what are called regular sporting rules. Therefore, they're not printed in the sporting regulations. And that's why they're not public, because they haven't been submitted yet to the International Sporting Code, which should have taken place in January, but didn't for bizarre reasons. And instead, these are secret rules. Now, the fact is, the reason I say they're not rules is what they are is they're called guidelines. And basically, these are guidelines that are driver led. So these come from driver discussions last year after the Austin and Mexico debacle, coming into Qatar and then being kind of revised again for 2025. These are guidelines that are driver led. So all of the drivers voted on these. And in fact, interestingly, only one driver voted against these, which everyone assumes is Max Verstappen, with good reason, to be fair, because he hasn't been very happy about these rules. But, we can't confidently say it was Max Verstappen who voted against them. That should be noted. But yeah, these are rules that the drivers essentially kind of came up with, and then they get passed to the teams afterwards, the FIA, and then they're ratified, and they're put in a set of driver guidelines. And these guidelines are used then by the stewards to make decisions. So this is so that there is consistency for the drivers with what way they want overtaking and defending and so on to be handled. So it's not that the stewards' kind of hands are completely tied by these, technically speaking. However, they follow them because that way the drivers can't complain because, well, it was the drivers that came up with them. So they follow these pretty much to a T. So last year we had four guidelines that they had to follow for overtaking on the inside, and three that were for overtaking on the outside. And the outside rules have stayed very similar. I'll get to those in a minute. And the inside rules have changed dramatically. So the kind of main change for these overtaking rules, to explain them, has been that last year a lot of priority was given to the defending car, so to make it easier for the defending car to defend. And that is where we saw Austin and Mexico last year, where essentially, to boil it down, the simplicity of these were, if you can be ahead at the apex on the inside, then basically it's your corner, and you don't really have to give any racing room to the car that's trying to overtake. Now it's been kind of flipped on its head, essentially. Whereas if you're ahead at the apex, and that ahead at the apex definition has changed dramatically as well, then you don't have to give any racing room to the car that is defending on the outside. So this year's regulations, the drivers have decided that they wanted to prioritize the overtaking car to make overtaking easier. And I guess, given the fact that we've now got this huge issue with dirty air, that is probably a good thing. But I do think this is going to consistently cause some issues. So let's go through the simple way of explaining these. So when you're overtaking on the inside, as we saw in Jeddah, and why it baffles me that Max was annoyed about this, essentially, overtaking on the inside now means having to do a couple of things. First of them is to have the apex at the entry to the apex at the apex itself. Now, being ahead at the apex when you're overtaking on the inside no longer actually means being fully ahead, which is what a lot of arguments were brought about in Jeddah. And then we saw this with Piastri in the sprint and Antonelli. People were complaining again. being ahead no longer means like having a nose ahead of the other car. What it actually means now on the inside, because it's different from the outside, is to have your front axle, take that as your front wheels basically, ahead or at least alongside the driver's mirror. So if you're on the inside, essentially what you can do is you can get your wheel. So we'll do this here. So you get your front wheel of your car. If that front wheel is at least here, say, alongside the mirror of the other car, then you have earned that corner, essentially. Now, you need to have it there at the entry to the apex, so just before the apex, and at the apex itself. This is to kind of stop somewhat people lunging. But once you've done that, you then have earned the corner. Then you have to make sure you make the make the turn within track limits, which Piastri did, say at Jeddah, for example, and Norris didn't in Miami and had to give the place back. And you have to do it in control. So the idea of the control piece, they very specifically say, and not have dived in. The idea here is that basically they don't want drivers to just do the Verstappen and kind of what Piastri has been kind of getting around to doing at points, and also what Norris did in Mexico, which is just completely let off the brakes, put the foot down, be ahead at the apex and say, it's my turn. You know, you have to be in control, and making the corner kind of says that as well. But also if you like lock up to make the corner, you've dived in. So you have to be in control, not have dived in, not lock up and make the corner itself. Crucially, the difference this year is if you do all of that, you do not need to leave any racing room to the car that is defending on the outside. So there is no more argument that, oh, he forced me off. It's like, well, he earned the right to that corner on the inside. So that is basically how that works. And that's why Piastri was fully legal in his move in Jeddah, and why he was fully legal in his move against Antonelli in the Miami Sprint. And it's also why you heard GP on the radio to Max essentially saying, peg that inside, like take that inside line, because they know that if you can hold the inside line, be ahead at the apex, you don't need to leave any room. So it makes it much harder for the car to then overtake. Now, around the outside, which was the contentious one we saw with Norris and Verstappen, but Verstappen was very much within the rules here to the letter of the law. It is a little bit different. So the way it works on the outside is you're trying to obviously gain racing room. So this is more that when you're trying to overtake around the outside, in order to gain racing room, you have to have your front axle, once again, the front wheels of your car, alongside the front wheel of the other car. So it's not the mirror on the outside, it is the front wheel. So this car coming around on the outside would need to be here, not here. So you can forget about the front wings kind of being ahead or anything. It's to do with front axles on the outside. And once you do that, then as long as you're, again, in a controlled manner and you stay within track limits, you are entitled to that room. And you have to do that at the entry to the apex as well as at the apex once again. And therefore, because Norris didn't have his front wheels quite alongside Verstappen, even though Verstappen wasn't fully in control, like he slid a bit, Norris had not earned racing room there. So he was not entitled to say he was forced off. Even though you could argue that in reality, where could he go? And Max did kind of lunge. It was an optimistic move anyway, unfortunately, for Norris. So Max didn't have to leave him any room. But yeah, I do think this is going to be a contentious talking point over the rest of the season, and something we will see over and over again, and something to watch out for. But yeah, those are the new overtaking rules for this season. So I hope that explains them a little bit there, Jeff. These are going to be contentious, but yeah, things like front axle to mirror need to keep into account. So if you see a car not ahead, when he's overtaking on the inside, remember, not being ahead is not important anymore. It's the front axle placement is really what's important. If you stuck around till this part in the video, it means you've probably enjoyed it, I would assume. And if you did, that means you'll probably also enjoy my F1 podcast, the blatantly biased racing podcast, where I'm joined by my co-host, the casual F1 fan, every week, as well as a range of other guests. And it's basically a weekly podcast where we just rant about everything that's going on, sometimes an hour, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, especially if we get a good chatty guest. So be sure to subscribe to that if you haven't already, and hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you again for watching. Bye. Okay, next question. Let's get into it. Jesus says, will Colapinto be in the car in Imola? Look, I don't normally have to do this, but I need to admit when I'm wrong. And frankly, I was wrong about Colapinto. He wasn't in the race at Miami, but he will be in Imola by all measures. There's been reporting since Miami that he'll be there. I basically had heard from some reliable sources that have told me things in the past that he will be done. Unfortunately, these are also the people who told me that Oscar Piastri was confirmed. And while they were right about that, it seems like they didn't know all of the information at the top. And this is another instance where Alpine, the same team, has screwed me over in terms of reliable sources. But yeah, so there's been some just major headlines now. Jack Doohan kind of put himself in a wrong place. You could tell by the stress in sprint qualifying that, you know, something is going on there. And then on top of that, there was a hot mic. I think it was from the CEO of Alpine, I'm not sure, where he wouldn't answer a question on television. I think it was French TV about when Colapinto will be in. May have been Argentinian television. I'm sure someone will correct me. But essentially, he wouldn't answer the question. And then the mic was still connected and it went to like the screen to move on from the interview. And he said Imola. So that kind of got everyone excited. Going back and talking to the Alpine guys, they basically said there was a last minute decision that basically they were going to give Doohan one more race. And it seems like it was kind of Flavio and the higher ups in Alpine essentially being a little bit concerned that with no testing, jumping him in a sprint weekend in Miami, even though they could have, technically speaking, was a bit risky with Franco's just lack of experience. So it makes sense to put him in Imola. Look, I don't want to bash on Jack. I know a lot of people will. I think given being thrown in, high pressure, knowing that his job could be taken away, I think he did a relatively good job. It's just not good enough. And frankly, I think that, you know, all of the potential upside of a Piastri with the frankly non-downside just makes sense. Like a lot of people that I've heard talk about, and I will just put this out there, I just need to be frank with all of you right now. I'm a big Colapinto fan. What he did in Williams was really, really impressive. I think his junior career was kind of underrated. And I think kind of there's a lot of, you know, strings you could look, or strings, what am I saying? You know, fanboying here. There's a lot of things you could look at, caveats in his junior career as to why he wasn't always up there. But I think he did a really good job in Williams. And what I was getting to is a lot of people are saying that, well, you know, he's really crash happy. Look at the crashes last season in the Williams. And I think there's two things you need to think about here is one, Jack has just been as crash happy. And, you know, there's a lot of caveats there in the Williams drive as well. And I know you're going to call me a fanboy again here, but in reality, Albon crashed a lot in that Williams last year as well. And I think other than the Las Vegas crash where he just kind of made a silly mistake, a lot of those you could kind of say, well, that's just him not used to the car. And Albon had a lot of those crashes as well. So can you really blame him? But more importantly, Jack has been making silly mistakes and crashing and causing crash damage too. So, I mean, if you're going to swap one driver for another, you might as well drop the one who's crashing a lot for one who could potentially crash a lot. If the one who could potentially crash a lot could potentially be faster, which I think he will be less pressured by any pressured situation, which Colapinto showed a lot last year, and crucially brings how much is it? A shitload of money to the team to help offset some of that crash money. So yeah, I don't expect Colapinto to crash as much as Doohan. He has experience in an F1 car now anyway from last year. So he will have kind of got over some of that, that Colapinto didn't. He will have had time to reflect. He will have had time on the sim. And I think, look, there will probably be some niggly moments in the first few races because he hasn't done preseason testing. But I just think when it comes to out and out, you know, racecraft, Colapinto is better. Oh, his overtake in Singapore last year was legendary. He just went for it. And I think that when it comes to just the pressure, Colapinto just swallows it up. And I think that is exactly what Alpine need right now. Someone who just, maybe they'll crash, but they'll get out. Their sponsors will cover it. And they'll just get back on the job unfazed by any of it. So, yeah, I think it's a good switch. And I think, yes, he will be in the car in Imola. I almost have no doubts now from what I'm hearing, but I've been wrong before. But this time, it's not just me that's hearing it from people that I talk to. It's also the race, Autosport, just plenty of outlets are kind of confidently saying it's been done. Some of them are saying it's being considered. It's been done from what I've heard, but I've been burned before. But here is praying for a Colapinto. But I will not jump on the bandwagon of bashing Doohan. I think he was put in a difficult situation. You know, and look, he doesn't really have many excuses given what the other rookies are pulling off, you know, but look, I don't want to bash him. I think he's done a good job, just not a good enough job. But I, for one, benvenido to my Colapinto. All right, let's see what the next question is, straight from the dyno's mouth. Duran asks, is George Russell the new Ricciardo? Oh, God. You know, at the moment, the blunt answer is no. But I do get what this is talking about, basically. Like where this is coming from. Because when we think about it, Ricciardo kind of had a very similar trajectory in many ways. So Ricciardo came in against a multiple world champion who was at the top of his game in 2014. And it was a new regulation set, new cars, and he frankly obliterated Vettel at that point. Now, Vettel wasn't happy with the car. Vettel was basically 1 foot out the door by that point, and the engine was dog shit. So, it's a lot of excuses you could make for Vettel, but Vettel wasn't driving his best that year, and Vettel swiftly exited the door and went to Ferrari for 2015. There is some similarities here in that George Russell came into the car after being a junior for Mercedes, just like Ricciardo was a junior for Red Bull. He was obviously a junior at Williams, though, just because they don't have a second team. And obviously he came in against a 7-time world champion who had been embedded at the team for a long time. And frankly, he beat that world champion over the course of their time together before that world champion incidentally put his tail between his legs and fled to Ferrari. There are a lot of similarities here. The biggest one, of course, is that after that 7-time world champion left, or in the case of Ricciardo, that 4-time world champion left for Ferrari, they brought in a young hotshot very quickly who looked to be the next Vettel or the next Hamilton. In Vettel's case, that was Max Verstappen, who has gone on to win, interestingly, 4 championships with Red Bull before Red Bull fall off in its 5th run. But in Mercedes' case, it's been Antonelli. And the difference here is, I guess, where we could draw the line between the two, is that the difference here is that, Antonelli is not doing a Ricciardo on Vettel. So, Russell is still beating Antonelli by a very wide margin in terms of points, at least, and just in terms of consistency and performances. So I think the difference here is one or the other, and you can look at it depending on where your fanboyism sits. You could either look at it as this is Antonelli showing he's not an ex-Verstappen, or you could look at it in terms of Russell is not a Ricciardo. So Russell is a far better driver than, say, a Ricciardo. Now, I don't want to go on the Jacques Villeneuve loop here because Ricciardo was a spectacular driver and went toe-to-toe with Verstappen for a long time over their early career. And I think Verstappen is a better driver, full stop. But Ricciardo did, pull it back and give a good fight. And I think that we haven't quite seen that yet because Antonelli is only 6 races in and he's building slowly but surely. So I think right now the answer to that question is no, because I think that Russell is a better driver than Ricciardo. And I don't say that to dig Ricciardo. Ricciardo was spectacular. What he did even in Renault afterwards was spectacular. And I rate Ricciardo very, very highly, in fact. And I think there was probably a pragmatic choice to be given to give him the car, the Red Bull this year. And it may have worked out. Probably not. But yeah, I think Russell is better than Ricciardo in many ways. I think he is a better qualifier, frankly, and Ricciardo was a stunning qualifier. I think he is probably just as good in terms of racecraft, but I also think that Russell is more strong-minded. And I think that's where the big difference will be between the two, in terms of Russell kind of has a lot more confidence in what he can do, I think, than Ricciardo had. And as soon as Ricciardo's on-track performance wasn't living up to where he thought he was, that confidence from Ricciardo got eroded very, very quickly. And I just don't see that happening with Russell. I think the big test will be in 2026. Now, it depends on how quickly Antonelli can rise as well. Because if Antonelli can rise quicker than, say, Piastri did, which took 2 full seasons, that could put a lot of pressure on Russell. But if, for example, Mercedes do have the dominant engine next year and they manage to kind of turn around things so that they can beat McLaren on aerodynamics, then that would mean that Antonelli will need to be at basically Piastri's level by the start of next season. Because if not, then what will happen is Russell will get a world championship next year. He'll get a win, a relatively easy one, and that will see him build his confidence. And I think that is where the path between Ricciardo and Russell would very quickly split apart. So I guess the long story short, because I've just gone on a rant here, long story short, to put it in perspective, he is in danger, I think, of becoming a Ricciardo. But there is a lot of factors that need to play out before that happens. So Antonelli needs to kind of jump up quite quickly, or Mercedes need to be in a Red Bull situation where their trajectory towards a world championship becomes very, very long. Or worse than that, if Max becomes available, that could put Russell in a situation where he doesn't get the chance, to test himself against a proper Antonelli in a proper car. So short answer, no, not right now. But I will say it is a good question, because the trajectory for it to happen is it's potentially there. I hope that answers it. Probably not. All right, next question, straight from the dyno's mouth. Let's see what we got here. Mark, has the full Oscar now arrived? Yes, frankly. I was really, really impressed by Oscar in Miami. Everything he did was on par, and Lando has his work cut out for him now. I think the thing is that Oscar's deficiencies last year, are kind of offset now to the point where Lando's going to really need to change his style and approach and the way he goes racing wheel to wheel in order to beat Oscar now. The big deficit that Oscar had last year, that if he had it carried into this year, could have cost him serious. Like, put it this way. If Oscar had carried his qualifying pace from last year into this year, Lando would be leading the championship by like a country mile right now without any issue. To be honest, he would have won 3 races on the bounce already, I think, in terms of just style. So that's where Oscar has made a huge jump. Oscar was nearly 2/10 off in qualifying to Lando last year, and now he's pretty much even. I think in terms of just raw pace, and we saw this at Miami in qualifying, and we saw this in Miami in the last stint for both of the McLaren drivers, that at his peak, Norris is still a faster driver. But the problem is that the difference in pace between the two of them is so minimal now that it comes down to kind of that last 10th in qualifying. And it seems like Oscar is more confident in the car. And I think it's partly down to the fact that he doesn't get in his head so much. So he just kind of gets the job done over Lando. And I think that's where there is a huge difference between the two now in terms of just mental state. So Lando is still at his peak the faster driver, but that peak difference is so small. And the difference is Oscar is consistently hitting kind of right beside it or above it. And Lando isn't hitting his peak all the time. Now, maybe Lando will get comfortable with the car, but he's going to have to do that quick. And even then, the difference is so minimal that I think that in reality, that pace advantage that Lando has is now gone. And that's where Oscar has arrived. And where Oscar beats Lando outright, honestly, is just in terms of his racing craft, you know? Like every single time Lando goes toe to toe with Max, Lando comes out for the worse. You know, Lando makes a silly mistake here. He gives in to Max's aggression. He allows Max to play those games. He doesn't know where and when to kind of come in. Whereas Oscar in Miami was just perfection in terms of craft. Like even when he didn't get the overtake done, but caused Max to lock up, he put Max on the back foot. Like he kind of faked one way, went the other way, put some pressure on. And as soon as Max locked up, you could see that Oscar just kind of drifted in behind, didn't try and run off the track, didn't try and make any silly move, just kind of fell in behind. And then all of a sudden it was like, right, Oscar's right on him now and is going to get him there. And we saw this in Oscar at Baku last year, for example, with that move. He just knows when to go. He knows how to size up his opponent. He knows how to put his opponent on the wire. And I think where it comes to a Verstappen v Oscar fight as well is that Max knows he can't do kind of the same kind of over aggressive moves with Oscar that he can do with Lando, because Oscar won't give him that room to do it. And Oscar knows exactly when to dive, when not to. He's not going to be phased by that kind of, okay, we're both going to hit the wall approach that Max likes to do. And I think that is a huge advantage now. So yeah, has Oscar arrived? Yes. And the only thing Oscar was lacking really last year was two things. The first half of the season last year, he was still getting on top of tires. I think he very much got over that by the end of the season anyway. And the second part was qualifying. Now that he's got his qualifying and just general race pace up there with Lando, the problem is with the dirty air and with it being so close in qualifying, Lando doesn't have that outright advantage anymore. And I think that unless Lando can fix that, if it comes down to just a duel in the desert of the two of them, you know, actually fighting for position on track, I think Oscar's just a better racer when it comes to wheel. And I think all the evidence points in that direction. So yeah, unless Lando can really get on top of that car and make sure that every race, without fail, like last year, like unless he can decimate Oscar for the rest of the season in qualifying pace, Oscar has this title kind of sewn up in reality. I hope that's not the case. I hope McLaren, you know, can make Lando more comfortable to give us a fight. I hope that Barcelona maybe brings, you know, Red Bull back into it a little bit. Maybe Mercedes can bring some upgrades. But as it looks right now, Oscar is nearly as fast as Lando, but more importantly, is faster when it counts at those high pressure moments when Lando kind of falls apart under stress. And then when it comes to on track overtaking and defending, Oscar is just better at that. Full stop right now. So yeah, Oscar has arrived. Thank you for the question. All right, let's see what we have in the dinosaur's mouth. Oh yeah. Hi, May. Who will be the Cadillac driver lineup? Yeah, this is an interesting one. I haven't thought about it much. I think the obvious answer is it looks like Perez is going to be in that car for next year. However, from everything I'm hearing, Perez is holding off until the summer break, basically for the kind of traditional silly season, where there's not likely much to happen this year, given everyone kind of has contracts for next year. But I guess he's probably hoping that Max jumps ship. That causes Russell to move somewhere, which could cause some buyouts, some contract changes, some move arounds. And that may open up a place where Perez could jump in. I think it's probably because, I mean, anywhere else he tries to go is not going to be a top team. Like, even if Max moves, Red Bull's not going to go back. You know, they've got Sonoda. They will probably just, you know, reap up Russell, and you'll probably just get a straight swap between the two teams. So I can't see a situation where Perez gets into, there is no situation where Perez gets back into Red Bull. But what he's probably hoping for is all of that mess causes Russell to maybe go somewhere else, like, you know, an Aston Martin, for example. And that then causes Alonso to say retire, which then means Red Bull have to grab someone from somewhere else, maybe a Hail Mary of a Leclerc, a Norris, a Piastri, for example, which is unlikely. But, then that frees up something somewhere else and everything kind of, the musical chairs kicks off. I think that's unlikely. And I think he ends up at Cadillac. He does need to be careful that Cadillac don't just lose patience and book someone else. But in reality, I think as much as people, Bottas fans in particular, might not want to hear this, Perez is the best option for them, because Perez, if they get kind of him back with his confidence, which he may get after a year, will be better, I think, than Bottas in a couple of different ways. I think Perez is a better driver than Bottas, and I know I've gotten slack for that in the past, but I think he is. But also Perez has been at a top team more recently than Bottas, which is, gives them a lot of insights into how the workings happen, whereas Bottas hasn't been at Mercedes since 2021, a team that has faltered since. So if you're looking at insight. So for me, it's Perez, and I think that's a basically done deal. It's just both of them kind of figuring out when they'll wait until. Obviously, Herta is the obvious choice. I know Cadillac and Andretti in particular wanted to get Herta for a long time. But I think outside of that, if Herta doesn't come together for any reason, their options are kind of somewhat limited in many ways. And it's going to depend on whether someone else frees up, like a Lawson, frees up and they get a full Red Bull rejects team. Or, there's a few other drivers around F2 and F3 that potentially they could swap up. Maybe a Theo Pourchaire as well from old days that they could bring in if Herta's not there. There is talk as well, and you'll notice he was at the event on Saturday, was it? Mick Schumacher was clocking around, which honestly, with some of the sponsorship that can bring and the fact that they're putting a Ferrari engine in there, could be a call. But if a gun was put to my head and I had to guess who would go in there, it's going to be a Perez, Guan Yu Zhou lineup. There's a variety of reasons for Guan Yu Zhou. Guan Yu Zhou, I think, as much as he's not the best driver on the grid, he is a capable pair of hands. The more important link is the fact that Ferrari engines will be powering the Cadillac, and having Guan Yu Zhou there would obviously make sense then, because you've got a Ferrari engine in the car, which he understands, he drives, he probably brings some sponsorship. But more importantly than all of that is that GM has a lot of sales riding on everything in China. And for Cadillac, who are making big plays as like a big luxury car brand in China, having a Chinese driver would obviously make sense there. So if I had to put a gun to my head and say like, okay, right, you're going to die if you don't get this right, my thinking would be it'll be Perez and Guan Yu Zhou. It'll either be that or Perez and Herta, but I would say it's probably going to be Perez and Guan Yu Zhou. Thanks for the question. Subscribe.